The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together.
Well, they didn't.
Very serious.
The referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hello and welcome to Scottish Independence podcast number 38. And those of you that listen regularly will have noticed that in some recent shows, as well as our usual programming of the interviews and For All That discussion programme, I've been trying to add in some talks on issues that surround the debate, because some of the things that are coming up in the independence debate are global issues. What Scotland wants to enter the global scene. It wants to be involved in areas that are closed off to it now. But there's also dangers in staying with the UK and some of the things that they're planning to do. And one of these issues is the European Convention on Human Rights. You may have seen recently Cameron and Theresa May giving hints that the Tories are considering actually withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights. A couple of kind of weak excuses have been given. They want to make it easier to deport criminals and so forth. But it's a much, much broader issue than that. So I was given permission to reproduce this talk here, and it was given by Shami Chakrabarti of the group Liberty, which campaigns on human rights. And she talks in general about the importance of human rights. And this is something that obviously, if Scotland stays part of the UK and loses its membership of the European Convention on Human Rights, what sort of society is that likely to create? What are some of the possibilities? What is the importance of a thing like the European Convention on Human Rights? So I think it's a very interesting talk, and it's very much an important issue in this campaign. So I'll let you listen to it, and I'll speak to you at the end. This is reproduced with the kind permission of Liverpool John Moores University, and it's part of their Roscoe Lectures series.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks to all of you for giving up what would have been such a beautiful, almost summer's evening in Liverpool. Clearly, this is where the sun always shines and the sky is always blue. I shall come more often. It's a great honour to give this 98th Roscoe lecture. I'm sure that someone much grander and worthier will give the 100th Roscoe lecture. I can't wait to find out. But it is a great pleasure to be in Liverpool and an honour to give this lecture, if slightly daunting to have come into Jeremiah Clark's trumpet voluntary. This is not the reception that a scruffy human rights campaigner is used to. But you in turn must be, of course, a very brave audience. Because you are about to hear from someone that the Sun newspaper once called the most dangerous woman in Britain. Yeah. Look at me, the most dangerous woman in Britain. And I think you must take some comfort from that Britain can't be so dangerous after all, if this is the best it can do. I should say that it's quite a nice icebreaker to go up to people and say, I'm the most dangerous woman in Britain. And you sometimes get a little titter like that, and you know, it's a good way to sort of warm up. But a year or two ago, I went to Derry in Northern Ireland and tried the same gag. Ladies and gentlemen, you're a very brave audience because you're about to hear from the most dangerous woman in... Didn't quite go down in the same way. And afterwards, I was a guest of the British Council, and afterwards we were given a drink in the Guildhall in Derry, another magnificent building, a bit like this one, and an immaculate woman, a little bit older than me, but immaculately dressed and made up, approached me at this drinks reception and said, "You were only perceived as the most dangerous woman in Britain." I really was. Chilling. absolutely chilling. Went back to feeling like a sort of swotty 11-year-old, being slightly intimidated by the more confident girl. And of course, she turned out to be someone who had taken part in the armed struggle and spent many years inside and is now part of democratic politics in Northern Ireland. What that tells us about human rights and security, I will just leave for you to think about. But what I will say at the very outset is that the title that I'm addressing this evening is actually a nonsense. The balance between human rights and security. The idea of the two ideas being in tension at all, for me, is a nonsense. Now, if it had been liberty and security or privacy and security, fair enough. But human rights and security, I will argue to you, are completely interconnected. Why? Well, firstly, because personal security has got to be a fundamental human right. And of course, we think of it that way when we think about human rights over there in various countries where security and indeed rights and freedoms are far less secure than they are here in Britain, where we are so lucky for the most part. So personal security has got to be a fundamental human right. But also because there cannot be security for any society, let alone for any individual or family or community. There can be no long-term security without respect for fundamental rights and freedoms. That's my argument. I shall try and make it good in the next 25 minutes or so, and then you can come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. Looking at this audience, I suspect you are. So that's my argument. Security, human rights, and indeed the rule of law are completely interconnected. I'll go further still, that you can't have democracy itself without respect for fundamental rights and freedoms. Just as we've learnt, I think, in recent years that a market, particularly a market in financial services and banking that is unregulated, will eat itself and eat a few more of us besides, democracy needs quite a lot of checks and balances to keep a society free. Let me suggest why. A government is elected with a massive majority, a great popular mandate, charismatic leader, wonderful, everybody's happy. Popular majority, free elections, democracy, wonderful, yes, of course. But a little while later, the government in question decides that perhaps the free press that's criticising it, used to support it, is now a little bit critical of the government that was freely elected and has this massive majority. The free press is becoming slightly annoying. So perhaps we now use our enormous majority and our great popular mandate and our charismatic leadership and our support to interfere with the free press, to suggest that dissent is disloyalty in this wonderful democracy of ours, and we start censoring the press and we start shutting down peaceful dissent. No free speech anymore. Perhaps then we, as a popularly elected government, decide that our opponents are suspect and corrupt, and we interfere with independent policing and independent courts, and we see that our opponents are arrested and locked up without a fair hearing. We had a great democratic mandate after all, didn't we? We're the ones with the great majority. Why shouldn't we just kind of interfere just a little bit with the right against arbitrary detention and the right to a fair trial, and with independent judges and independent police chiefs? Because we won the election. And so it continues until we decide, with our great popular support and our great democratic mandate and all the wonderful things we want to do for the good of our people, that maybe those general elections that are due to take place in just a few years' time ought to be delayed. Just for a few years. Just until this or that or the other crisis is averted. For your own good, sir. And this has happened elsewhere in the world, even in our lifetimes, ladies and gentlemen. Without entrenched fundamental rights and freedoms and the rule of law, today's democracy can descend quite quickly into tomorrow's tyranny. It's not democracy anymore, it's mob rule. And that is, if you like, a regulatory argument for saying you cannot have democracy without fundamental rights and freedoms. For other people, some people of faith and others besides, it's simpler than that. Not a democratic argument, but a basic argument about what it is to be a human being. A notion of us all being equal in our dignity and worth, all being somehow special just because we're alive. Not because of our gender or our sexuality or our nationality, not because we're good people or bad people, not because we've paid our taxes or even been alive long enough to vote or pay our taxes, but just because we're alive. The idea that there are some rights and freedoms that are non-negotiable, that there's something about human dignity that you cannot be stripped of, even if you are in a wretched state and you've lost your own sense of self-respect. That's where, for a lot of us, the idea of fundamental rights and freedoms begins. Now, of course, the idea that I passionately believe in, the idea of universal, fundamental rights and freedoms that attach to everyone because they're human, has its golden age just after World War II. This is the moment when we stop thinking just about rights for people in Britain or rights for people in France or the United States and start thinking about a framework that is truly universal, global. And I think it was an extraordinary time that we need to remember and celebrate again and again and again, particularly when there are threats to it. Because every generation thinks that it knows everything. Every generation thinks that previous ones had it easy. But let's remember that the idea of universal human rights was born out of the Holocaust and the Blitz. This wasn't 1960s hippie nonsense. This is from a generation who knew the horrors and terrors of war, who knew about threats to national security, personal security, and what that feels like when bombs are dropping on your own city. And it's that generation that decided that some notion, some basic, modest bag of fundamental rights and freedoms is essential, not just to humanity, but to peace and security and democracy all over the world. And it really was an extraordinary thing that they achieved, it seems to me. People slightly to the left of politics, slightly to the right of politics, people with no political alignment, people representing all the great world religions and people of no religious conviction whatsoever, came together. Winston Churchill, famously in this country, Eleanor Roosevelt in the United States, but people from all parts of the United Nations coming together and saying there are some non-negotiables that are essential to the decent, good society and that are an important pillar to the rule of law. And of course, whether it's Libya or whether it's London, there can be no rights and freedoms without the rule of law. Checks and balances on the powerful, and in particular those that uphold fundamental rights and freedoms.